Good morning and welcome to our fourth and final panel session, which today is Cobalt in the Circular Economy. It's been a busy conference, a lot of meetings going on and people meeting up after a long break. So it's great to have you joining us here this morning for the panel, especially after such an enjoyable dinner last night and no doubt some drinks afterwards. So, as Adam said, my name is Tom Fairley and I'm Sustainability Manager at the Cobalt Institute, and it's my privilege to moderate this panel today. Before we go to the panelists, I wanted to look back on yesterday's session within the context of circular economy. So we've seen projections of the growth in demand of cobalt, driven by the now rapid transition to electric vehicles, a move as part of the green transition. We've looked at the distribution of cobalt resources and what this might mean for material supply and energy security. And we've looked at just transition as we finally make a move towards a net zero world. And I think we might touch on some of these topics today and see how they're interlinked. And of course, pass on my thanks to Professor Dieudonné Tamboué for his intervention and some key points around circularity. I think something I noted in particular, the idea of equitable payment as part of circularity. And that really, I think, ties in nicely with the just transition conversation that we were having yesterday in the last panel of the day. And of course, we had the intervention as well of the US Department of Energy, and the importance of circularity was clear in his points as well. So we see cobalt as part of the green transition, but its position in the green transition can't be taken for granted. It's not good enough to just say that cobalt is essential. There are various substitution threats to cobalt, so it's vital that cobalt earns its place in the transition through industry's responsible actions. We've already heard at the conference, thankfully, that cobalt has good properties. It provides high energy density, stable, durable batteries, catalysts, superalloys, hard metals, and so on, all which will be needed for the transition. And of course, it's an infinitely recyclable material of high economic value. So it's got a lot going for it. Our panel today will be looking at cobalt and its value chains and discussing how we can take advantage of cobalt and its properties, make it more circular, and look at what this circular economy might be like for the value chain. And I think for us at the Cobalt Institute, this panel is really kicking off our efforts on circular economy and our work program for 2022, where we'll be looking at the whole value chain and how circularity is embedded. And I'm delighted that someone from our consultants is joining us on our panel today to discuss. So we were going to start with an introduction speech from Professor Karen Hudson-Edwards, the professor Sustainable Mining at University of Exeter. As we were lucky enough to have both the interventions from Professor Dieudonné Tamboué and from Deputy Secretary Zurich as well. We will now, for timing's purposes, move that to the breakout session after the various panels today. I do suggest you take the opportunity to watch this. The video is an excellent overview of circular economy upstream at the extraction stage and talks about responsible innovation and, of course, highlights Met4Tech, a UK initiative of which the Cobalt Institute is a partner, and the David Waite's PhD that's being held at Exeter, which, of course, is looking at circular economy. So I'd now like to invite my panelists up onto the stage, and we'll start our panel session. So if you'd like to join me. And just to introduce our panel today, we have Michael Insulan of Electra, we have Craig Woodburn of BritishVolt, Chris Heron of Eurometaux, Yanchen Wang of Shanghai Metals Markets, and Mathilde Legay of LGI, the Cobalt Institute's Circular Economy Consultants. So I think a quick thank you to our audience and maybe a welcome applause. Thank you. So our panelists will each make a short opening presentation, and we'll follow this with a sort of fireside discussion, and timings permitting, we will also have an opportunity for some Q&A from the audience as well. So to kick things off, I'm delighted to hand over to Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tom. I would like to thank, of course, Adam and Tom and the CI for actually inviting us to speak here today. It was not a last moment kind of thing, but it was really, it is really a pleasure to be here. And I'm also surprised by the pretty extensive crowd, because mostly on the third day people are in meetings or very hungover somewhere else. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, of course. I work for Electra battery materials. I think the font here has changed a bit since I sent it, but I'm sure it'll be fine. Electra Battery Materials is a Canadian company. We have assets in Canada, and we have assets in the United States of America. We're going to essentially develop the middle stream of the lithium-ion supply chain. This will start with the commissioning of a battery-grade cobalt sulfate plant, 5,000 tons in the first stage, in the sort of latter part of this year, Q4, with production out next year. That is followed shortly after by recycling in 2023. We will have a black mass and produce a series of products from that, including cobalt, nickel, lithium, copper, graphites. We will then progress to a nickel sulfate in 2024-25 and aim to have a battery precursor co-location. So we do not necessarily intend to produce PCAM ourselves, but the fact that we produce nickel and cobalt sulfate lends the site for co-location of PCAM, because you can run in solution, of course, to the PCAM plant at a much lower cost. And then, of course, we have the Iron Creek cobalt and copper project in Idaho, in the Idaho Cobalt Belt. So, circularity, because that is the topic of conversation. We get some people coming up to us saying primary refining is not required in this industry because there's so much recycling going on. Our view is that we need both, and I think this is the view of everyone here, of course. We did a brief thought experiment here in this chart. I've not put numbers on it because will disagree with numbers, but I put proportions that I think we can largely agree with. So since around 2000, 2001, you've of course had an increase in lithium-ion production. Mobile electronics, today lithium-ion batteries are in anything that's going cordless, right? So you had a pretty rapid increase in lithium-ion and cobalt-associated consumption over the past 2 decades. But of course, this has rapidly increased this demand growth with the advent of electric vehicles. And what I wanted to show with this chart is that even if we take the assumption of 100% recycling rates, so we recycle all the phone batteries, for instance, within 3 years of actual first production, and we recycle all electric vehicle batteries within 11 years, you will still not, over this full period and certainly to 2025, get anywhere near the actual raw cobalt that you need to sustain this battery revolution. And of course, this is a sort of thought experiment, right? So, first of all, we can establish that primary cobalt demand growth far faster, of course, than a recycling feedstock. And even if, we do think, if you look at lead-acid industry, you recycle essentially all lead-acid batteries today. You can do the same in lithium-ion, absolutely. But you will still not, over the next, certainly 2 decades, have recycling feed the whole cobalt industry. You do need primary. Some batteries are lost forever. Battery life may very well be longer than 3 or 11 years. Second life applications are, of course, rampant, and it's a good idea, of course. And recycling recoveries, we have heard that recycling, cobalt is, indefinitely recyclable, but the fact is there is yield losses in processing. So you will always lose a few % when you go through the recycling process. This is a picture of the inside of our recycling and sulfate refinery. It was already built largely when we bought it, so we are really just commercializing this, running a demonstration plant later in 2022, probably August, and commercializing in mid-2023. I would like to say that when it comes to circularity, localization is key, because you're not only recycling second life or end-of-life batteries here, you're also recycling off-specification PCAM, off-spec CAM, primary cells at the cell manufacturers, primary cells at the OEMs, the automakers, and of course also end-of-life batteries. So there's a lot of material out there, of course. We have taken this route that hydrometallurgical, circularity through hydrometallurgical recycling is the optimal way forward rather than pyrometallurgical, because you can actually access most of the materials that are in the lithium-ion battery, including the manganese and the lithium that would otherwise be lost. I'd also point out that Electra's ESG credentials are very good. I'm joined here by Renata Cardoso, ex-Vale, our new ESG head, and she will manufacture and produce a few documents about Electra's sort of approach to circularity and the green ambitions in the next few months. Now, wrapping up, I would like to make a very strong point here on collaboration in the circular economy. You can do this in two ways, right? You can go at it yourself. You can pick up batteries and go straight, to create a cell or at least a CAM from that. What our approach is essentially to capitalize on our core competence, which is really hydrometallurgical processing, and ensure that the companies that we work with, whether it's Glencore or ERG or IXM or anyone else, of course, in North America or globally, abides by the sort of strictest environmental ambitions to facilitate the circularity of this economy without impacting the environment. So collaboration is key. And as a final point here, although the font has changed dramatically, so hopefully you can read it, we are really focusing on our ESG performance here at Electra. So I invite everyone to contact us. We hope, our ambition is really to be the greenest cobalt sulfate out there and greenest sort of recycling capacity out there. So please do contact us for anything related to this matter.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. I think some interesting points there. Obviously, still a huge need for primary material, and that's going to be the case for some time to come. And a word collaboration, which I think is going to come up a couple of times today, and we'll touch on later. But now I'd love to invite Craig to come up and talk about BritishVolt. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for coming to listen. So I'm Craig Woodburn. I'm head of ESG at BritishVolt. For those that don't know, BritishVolt, we're a company that's producing cells, or planning to produce cells in the next year, 18 months. Primarily based in the UK, but with footprints in other parts of the world as well. We've got offices in various countries around the world as we rapidly expand. We're a newish company in terms of scale up. We're about just over 200 people now. But if you look this time last year, we were probably at 20 or 30 people. And if you look in 2 years' time, we'll probably be about 3,000 people. So if you start thinking about lithium-ion batteries and the rapid escalation of those around the globe, maybe BritishVolt is sort of typical of that rapid expansion. And my role as an ESG, head of ESG, is to make sure that we've got our strategies embedded within the business and our plans and aspirations are rolled out. And we've got a real opportunity to do that as a new business in a new sector that's really evolving very quickly. So yeah, from an ESG point of view. I've worked in sustainability all my life, so having this opportunity to make sure we're making the right choices and influencing the supply chain and the whole market is a real opportunity. And you can see on the screen there our ambitions around BritishVolt, and as I say, what we're aiming to do in terms of selecting our suppliers, our facility. I'll touch upon in a second our main facility in the UK, our first gigafactory that will be in the UK, and how that will deliver on some of the ESG credentials. I've only got a couple of slides, so this is the second slide before we pass on to the next speaker. But you can see there, and I guess this is just a summary of hopefully what everybody knows in the room, the ambitions and the savings that as we transition to decarbonise the world's transport, that actually there's the benefits in that in terms of some of the savings that we can do in the reductions of CO2, but obviously that's got to be balanced with other ESG credentials, biodiversity, water, energy, all those sorts of topics are all considered as well. So, and then obviously from today's topic is circularity in terms of how we link that in with the raw materials that are being supplied and how we then capture them and recover them and put them back into use. But the demand is rapidly increasing, obviously virtually exponentially. You can see the demand for EV batteries over time, and there's various studies out there. Like my colleague said, everybody can question the numbers, but different reports say different things, but we all know they're going up from the left to the right in terms of that increase in demand. So we're there, we need to be able to provide those cells. I think there's estimates around Europe needing 900 gigawatts of energy battery output in the next sort of 8 years by 2030. US is about 630 gigawatts estimate. So the need for batteries or cells is unquestionable, really, and we've got to look at how we meet that demand, whether that is with increased raw material extraction or, as we say, coupled with circularity and how we recover those materials that are already in use, are already been used and that we can capture. Looking at that bottom line there is really looking at how we need to collaborate along the whole value chain and supply chain there, really. BV as a manufacturer, we can't just operate, we know we just can't operate on our own. We've got to link in with the upstream and the downstream supply chain. And like I said, as part of the introduction earlier, we've got that opportunity to influence the supply chain and hopefully collaboratively make some of those changes that we know we all need to do to make the battery supply more sustainable and improve, I guess, the whole value chain and supply chain as we go forward. And then looking along that use and potential contradiction there in terms of reuse of batteries versus recycling and recovery. If you look at the waste hierarchy pushes us to reuse in preference to recycle and recover, but then in the legislation that's out there, we've got the push to have recycled content. So there's a bit of a conflict there, and I'm sure Tom will bring that out in the discussions later on. So yeah, that's a general introduction from me, BritishVolt. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into some of our ambitions, specifically on our facility, which I didn't mention in the north of England. What we can do immediately is select the energy supply and the sustainability credentials of that facility, and that's 100% renewable electricity. So then, as I say, we're doing our bit in terms of reducing that carbon intensity of the cells we produce. We've got to work collaboratively upstream and downstream to make sure that we produce the batteries with the lowest environmental impact and greatest positive societal impact, and that's our ambition and aim. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think some really interesting points there. The reuse versus recycle, yeah, we definitely will touch on. And influencing the supply chain was something I picked up, and perhaps a key element that we might need to consider as, as an industry. Anyway, delighted to hand over to Chris now.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be here today speaking with the Cobalt community and to be part of a truly regional panel, hearing similarities and differences with North America, the UK. Looking forward to hear about the Chinese market to come as well. I'll be speaking from the European perspective. I work for Eurometaux, the industry trade association representing Europe's combined metals value chain. And I'm having similar discussions to Michael, always about the continued need for primary metals to supply the energy transition, but with the European regulators in Brussels. For the opening remarks today, I'll bring some key insights from a study we recently completed with the Belgium University KU Leuven on metals for clean energy and pathways to solving Europe's raw materials challenge, which quantifies the resource needs of Europe's clean energy goals and the potential contribution of recycling and other sources of supply within that. Relevant for this panel discussion today, a striking conclusion from the study is that recycling is Europe's best long-term route to improve the self-sufficiency and strategic autonomy of its new clean energy system. In Brussels, the discussion today is centering on the topic of sufficiency, autonomy, and independence after Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really put the focus on some of our vulnerabilities and dependencies in the current fossil fuels-based system. And there's an intensifying discussion amongst the policymakers about what can we do for the transition to come. I think the situation in the case of Cobalt is really demonstrating why Lisbeth, the lead author, was reaching this conclusion. So I'll give 3 Cobalt takeaways from the report that was launched last month. The first is that in the next decade and beyond, we do expect to see indeed new demand in Europe from the local battery cathode production, where there are now concrete plans for bringing online over the next decade. Those current plans would lead to a doubling of cobalt requirements for Europe, over a doubling in the next decade. If you were to carry that through until 2050, which has big uncertainties, of course, it would be about a trebling of Europe's cobalt requirements. That's already taking into account the reduction of cobalt expected in battery technologies over the next decades and the increased use of LFP technologies, but the sheer volumes, of course, are still leading to this demand increase. When it comes to the discussion on autonomy and independence, the study is also concluding clearly that there's very low potential for Europe to mine the cobalt it needs domestically. There is a low volume of cobalt mining in Europe, predominantly in the Nordic markets today. That would provide about 3% of Europe's cathode manufacturing needs by the end of the decade. There's a very small project pipeline which could add about 1% to that, but the reality is that Europe's primary raw materials needs will have to come predominantly from foreign sources. And we expect continuation of the current situation where 70% of our primary materials are coming from the DRC, which makes that making that relationship and the mutually beneficial terms and progress there extremely important. In the long term, though, the study does conclude after 2040 there could be a very high potential from cobalt in European battery recycling. Full support to the conclusions earlier in the presentations. Currently, cobalt recycling is providing a fairly low contribution to Europe's supply. About 8% is currently coming from cobalt. And due to the demand increase, that will probably decline further by 2030. There's some potential we have to recycle more portable batteries, but not too much else until the end-of-life vehicle batteries from the electric vehicles start to come online after 2035, 2040. Europe is building up quite a significant stock of end-of-life vehicles, so if that carries on forward until 2050, the study estimates about 65% of Europe's needs could eventually be supplied from recycled sources. Compare that, for example, with lead-acid batteries, where there's a target for 80% by the end of this decade to come from recycled sources. So it's a huge, I guess, opportunity for Europe if it wants to prioritize these notions of autonomy and independence. Recycling is really the only route it has forward for a metal like cobalt, but we also have to be patient in the years to come. Cobalt and other metals, as has been mentioned, are permanent materials. They can recirculate in Europe's clean energy system for decades to come. And so we're also trying to always draw attention to this longer-term perspective that we are bringing materials into the economy, but it's a very different situation in terms of the circulation that can happen afterwards. Those numbers won't happen automatically, and it was already been mentioned there are a lot of bottlenecks that need to be addressed in the years to come. Just to touch on 3 of those in my opening remarks. Firstly, Europe needs to build up new recycling capacity in the next decade and beyond. An advantage we have now is the large volume of gigafactories planned and announced across the continent for this decade, which provides a business case for new recyclers to start activities and benefit from the production scrap from these operations as they wait for the end-of-life vehicles to become available. So we start to make more progress than we've been able to in the last years. Part two is to set the right legal framework. Europe has a new European batteries regulation, which is currently negotiating between the institutions and the policymakers in Brussels, which sets a number of requirements for improving the circularity of batteries, targets for end-of-life recovery of cobalt and other metals, and also recycled content obligations for new batteries after 2030. We're really clear that these recycled content obligations have to be really reflecting the realities of the market, the scrap pool that Europe has available, and the feasible quantities that there will be to have that recycled content after 2030. The market is developing so fast, there are so many uncertainties with things like second life applications that we'll probably need to revisit where we are today, closer to the time, and set those targets that aren't disproportionately pulling materials from other places or creating a non-level playing field. The third challenge is to ensure European battery waste is reaching European recyclers, and that's maybe the least addressed in Europe today. Currently, 1/3 of internal combustion engines in Europe, actually we don't know what happens to them. They're not entering the formal recycling channels, which they should do. They're either shipped away as used goods or end-of-life vehicles, legally or illegally, and we know there's a huge loss of materials from where they're ending up. This is something Europe needs to tackle, I'd say, in the next decade, both through addressing some of the loopholes for shipping those vehicles out without the rules there, and also supporting recycling capacity in the destinations they're ending up, for example, in Africa. Lastly, we can't be complacent that Europe will automatically have the rights to the battery waste that it has. I think these will be valuable commodities from 2040 onwards, the black mass that's available and other points. There'll be pulls from other regions who also need to make their own recycling obligations. Parts of the world like South Korea and China are building up big manufacturing powerhouses here, and I think Europe needs to be aware that it has to set the right framework for its recyclers to compete on a level playing field on the global level. So with that, hopefully, room for discussion in the Q&A, and really looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Again, some interesting points about the stock that will be building over time in Europe and how potentially you can retain that as well. So now we're moving on to our next presentation, and this is a video presentation by Jared Zhu from SMM. So we'll get that up on the screen now, and here's some interesting reflections on the Chinese recycling market, I believe.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. I'm Jared Zhu, the senior recycling analyst from Shanghai's metals market, and I would like to say thanks for the host of the Cobalt Institute for giving me such great opportunity to share the China cobalt recycling market with you. So let's get started. As we know, the cobalt recycling market is being paying much more attention to because of the new energy vehicle development and its demand for lithium battery and lithium battery material. In 2020 and before, China still serves as the main manufacturing country. For instance, China's cobalt sulfate accounts for 90% globally. However, China lacks the cobalt ore resource. As we noted, China only accounts for 8% of global cobalt ore mining capacity. So therefore, with a limited battery metal supply, the pricing power and the supply is dominated by overseas countries, which is against the sustainable development of China's new energy vehicle industry in the long term. So considering such background and the limitation, China is actively developing a city mine, as also called the recycling. And we can see here that instead of start from the traditional ore, China utilizes its large new energy consumer base and makes the city mine as the starting point. And from the city mine, China has successfully formed a new closed-loop value chain, as we can see in this yellow part, with its recycled cobalt capacity accounting for 20 globally. So to sum up, China develops recycling business for the purpose of securing strategic resources, grasping bargaining power, reducing raw material costs, and to form closed business loop. So after we have introduced the background of cobalt recycling in China, now let's focus on the China cobalt recycling market dynamics. The first slide we show here is the China cobalt sourcing channels, mainly includes the lithium battery channel and traditional channel, these two parts. And for the lithium battery channel, we break down by the production waste flow and the end of life flow. You can see the green and the blue flows. And for the production waste flow, it mainly comes from the lithium battery or material company. And given the large expansion of these companies, and SMA expects in 2022 the recycled product from this part will grow 30 to 40% this year. The end of sourcing channel mainly includes the new energy vehicle end user, the commercial vehicle operator, the digital product user, and the 3 or 2-wheel, the electric vehicle user. SMA expects that this end of life sourcing would be the main sourcing channel in the future. Ideally, it would be 2023 to 2025, because when the first kind of end of life new energy vehicle reaches the scrapping period, and it would contribute huge momentum for the accessible recycled product. And based on SMA assessment, currently the sourcing channel for lithium battery is still relatively not very mature, because it's not very short and efficient. And some unregulated players' participation has made this market more complicated. However, given the large end user market size and as we have mentioned, the growing production waste from lithium battery and material company, the production waste to sum up, the lithium battery will contribute 80% of the total source cobalt in 2022 in China. And for the traditional industry sourcing channel, which here we mainly include the super alloy and the hard alloy. And comparatively speaking, the sourcing channel of the traditional industry is more short and efficient. However, the recycled cobalt is relatively limited, only account for 14% in 2022 in China. So after such cobalt recycling layout, how many cobalt have been recycled in China? Let's move on to this slide, which we break down the China cobalt raw material by the primary, which is from the cobalt ore or the intermediate, and the secondary, which comes from the recycling part. As we can see here, that the primary still accounts for the largest share of China's cobalt raw material supply. However, in the future, the domestic secondary supply will become the main driving power. And as we can see, the CAGR for the secondary cobalt supply reaches 32% in 2022 to 2025. And with such high growth, the secondary cobalt supply is expected to take large market share from 18% in 2022 to 26% in 2025. And if we further break down the secondary supply of cobalt by the lithium battery industry and the traditional industry, we can find that the lithium battery will contribute more share of the secondary cobalt supply, with 86% in 2022 to 93% in 2025. And now we know that the China cobalt recycling is expected to witness high growth in the future and contribute more share of the raw material supply. And but what factors may affect the cobalt recycling supply? Here, SM have listed 3 factors. The first is the lithium battery demand and NMC type lithium battery installment. As we know, the lithium battery downstream serves as a major sourcing channel for cobalt. So how many lithium battery will be installed will have certain effect on how many cobalt will be recycled. Another issue is the NMC installment, which is NMC versus LFP. As we know, the LFP does not contain the cobalt, However, nowadays the LFP battery in China is getting more popular, given its cost effectiveness, good safety performance, and improvement in its energy density. So, how much share of LFP battery would be installed will have certain effect on how many cobalt could be recycled in China. The second part is the cobalt price trend. As we know, the cobalt price affects the volume of recycled cobalt because nowadays in China, the cobalt recycling pricing mechanism is still based on the primary cobalt price, and also the such price will also affect the profitability of players conducting cobalt recycling business in China. The second factor is the sustainable value chain formation. And here we take the European Union's battery policy as example. And in Article 8, for instance, the European regulation regulates that certain share of recycled battery material should be used in the lithium battery production. And that would bring certain effect on the Chinese players. For instance, if the China's lithium battery manufacturer wants to export the lithium battery to Europe in the future, it would be required to use certain share of recycled material, which will enable the Chinese players to source more recycled product. So that's all the content I want to share with you guys with the background of China's cobalt recycling and the current China cobalt recycling dynamics. And SM will keep following China cobalt recycling market dynamics. And for more information, you can visit our website and contact me via email. And at last, I wish the conference to be a huge success. Thanks again, guys. Bye-bye.
Excellent. I think that was a really interesting overview, a lot of interesting figures, the city mine and quite surprising secondary material going into manufacturing as early as 2025. So very, very interesting presentation. I'm delighted, our last speaker, I'll pass over to Mathilde.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today for this last day. It was a very nice dinner yesterday, so really enjoyed it. So just to talk a little bit about LGI, Sustainable Innovation. We are a consulting firm in innovation, and we specialize in energy, but also in critical raw materials. And we are involved in different European research projects on innovation. Okay. So, what is circularity? To me, circularity is really a systems approach. So you can find circular economy can really generate environmental, economic, and social benefits. On the environmental aspect, it can really help tackle the biodiversity and the climate crisis by having a more responsible use of consumption of resources. On the social aspect, it can redistribute the value along the chain, and in terms of economic benefits, it can generate profit. Companies have many incentives to move towards a circular economy. The first one is you want to be respecting your climate targets. You want to make sure that you're aligned with your biodiversity roadmaps. You want to make sure you avoid supply chain disruption by having a diversification. You want to build new business models, engage with customers in different ways, and really being exemplary in terms of social and environmental impacts. So there are different ways to actually identify circular opportunities. The first the first circular opportunity is really the power of inner circle, where you have materials that can actually be refurbished or repaired or remanufactured. You also have another flow that is where you actually have materials that are designed to last longer and can really be on the market longer. And you have a third option that is really that you design products that can be reprocessed a second time or a third time. And last but not least, you have the closed loops that really enables the waste or the disassembled products to actually be used as a feedstock to come back in the loop and be processed again. So to have these new ways of thinking in terms of material flows, we need to build new business models to make sure that we can generate profits while having an impact on the environment and societal impacts. So I'm just going to walk you through different examples of business model in circular economy. So the first one will be Fairphone. So it's a business model that is about product life extension. So, okay, my slides keep going faster than I'd like to. So I don't know how to pose this. But so the product life extension is a business model where you extend the life cycle of the product, and you make sure that you can engage with customers in different way by having long-lasting relationships. And it's the case of Fairphone. Here, Fairphone, the Fairphone is designed to actually last 5 years, and you can actually repair the phone by yourself by buying a new battery or by buying a new camera module. So you make sure that your phone, instead of lasting for 3 years, can last for 5 years by having a new Fairphone. And by this, you really have you make sure that you use the product as much as you can while having this new engagement. You also have product as a service. For example, the Chinese company NIO developed this offer where you actually can go and swap out your battery at a station just to make sure that it's still in use. The company actually, in this way, can, of course, recover the materials at the end, but also they engage you in having a battery that is always recharged, and where it enables you, as a customer, to actually have to pay less upfront because you can buy the car and rent. Thank you very much. So yeah, you can really have this way of you pay for the car and you rent the battery every month, so you have to pay less upfront, and the Chinese company can engage you in a long-lasting relationship. Then we have another business model that could inspire you, is a resource recovery business model. So I'd like to take as an example one research project that is called the NEMO project. It's a project that actually reprocesses sulfidic tailings, and they recover critical metals such as cobalt, and then after that they actually use the sulfidic tailings that are cobalt-free and CRM-free as a substitute for construction as a cement. So it's another processing, but with other industries. And of course, you know the company Eurometaux, that was a Belgium company, and that is making sure that they can recover concentrates, but also digital waste, while having a closed loop system, but also a bit of an open loop system. So all these examples can inspire you to build new business model. And for this, we actually need collaboration. I think that's something that came up quite a long time. I think the Cobalt Institute it provides a good opportunity for networking and engaging with other industrials. And I really encourage you to really continue this conversation today by engaging on the topic on how you can build new business models with other industrials today. Yeah, thank you very much. And Tom, I'll pass you through.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. Yeah, collaboration coming up again, and I can fully endorse the idea of the CI being a meeting point for collaboration. So we're now going to move on to our panel discussion, and we were looking at cobalt as a highly recyclable material, an enabler of circular economy, and the wider opportunities there. And I guess I really want to start looking at the drivers, the barriers, potentially, and the opportunities surrounding, maximizing cobalt's circularity. So I'm going to start on recycling, and I think perhaps a seemingly self-evident question, but what are the drivers for recycling? And Chris, I'll start with you in the European context. There are several drivers there. Maybe you could expand on that.
I think, indeed, a main driver in the European context for recycling, at least in Brussels, is doing the right thing, being sustainable, having targets to be the best, to have recycling make up as much a contribution of the Green Deal as possible. What's probably undervalued still in the discussions, which is linked to what I was mentioning earlier, is the potential for recycling to be a source of resource security and eventually a level of autonomy for Europe or other economies to have loops which are reliable and functional. And I think if we had that as the top priority, then probably we would maybe set some of our legislation differently if we talk about things like the targets that we're creating. We have a number of discussions with policymakers where it's just set the targets as high as possible because we're Europe and we do the right thing. But with recycling, we really need to make the best use of the scrap pool that we have. And in Europe, our scrap pool, as of yet, isn't as big as other regions. So I think the drivers have to be a combination of sustainability, resource security, and also the business case, of course, has to be there. And that's where Cobalt has a great role because the business case is there in the batteries.
Excellent. Yeah, I think some really good points. The energy security things perhaps underplayed, and you touched on legislation, which we'll get onto in a little bit. But perhaps I can turn to Michael and look at sort of North American perspective, and also the drivers within your own business. Obviously, primary material is as you point out, a real main driver. But as a business and in the North American environment, what are the recycling drivers?
Well, I entirely agree with what you just said. I think in addition to that, of course, as a private enterprise, you need to generate value. So that's obviously the main driving force. You need to recycling offers value generation. Now, for us specifically, I think recycling came about from the synergy perspective, because when you're doing primary refining and you're supplying the precursor and CAM and cell industry, you do really need to take back material in the sort of manufacturing scrap process as well. You don't want to ship that too far. So you need essentially, ideally, a recycling facility very nearby the actual battery industry. So that's a main driver for us, and it is one that we can start working with quite immediately in Canada. We don't have to wait for the next 11 years for an EV to come off the road. The material is available very soon.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think locality is an interesting one, and obviously value addition, absolutely. And talking of manufacturing scrap, obviously, Craig, BritishVolt, you're planning ahead, and you have agreements with Glencore as well. So maybe you can open up a little bit about drivers for recycling with yourselves and BritishVolt.
Yeah, I think from BritishVolt's point of view, and from my ESG, wearing my ESG hat, I think touching upon what both of the previous panelists have just said, is that localization is really important as well, because environmentally and sustainability, we know that recycled content has lower carbon intensity for recovery than currently producing raw materials. And if you can recycle that and recover that close to where you're actually using the materials, then you reduce your carbon intensity even further. So for us, that's one of the drivers we've been working on. And as you say, the agreement with Glencore to take some of our production waste as we ramp up our facilities to recover that, recycle that locally, and also act as a stimulus for greater recycling within the UK. The UK government has noted we don't have many recycling facilities, and a lot of the UK OEMs, automotive manufacturers, their end-of-life batteries have to be shipped to Europe or further afield. So again, that's adding carbon intensity. So if we can localise that within the UK, it creates that that whole business circularity locally that we need to develop, and the UK government is supportive of that, and we're part of that.
Excellent. I understand that logistics element is a major cost at the moment with recycling. So at the moment we're looking at perhaps manufacturing scrap. Is this going to extend to end-of-life batteries as well?
Yeah, I mean the company with the joint venture with Glencore is called British Loop. So currently it's only focused on scrap battery waste, but I think as some of the presentations said earlier, we know what is recovered and the recycling rates of lead acid batteries, but when you look at lithium ion, we're much lower than that. The impending or developing EU legislation aims to drive that up, but we've got to encourage people, incentivize people to recover and put those electronic products back into recovery. We've probably, if you look at home, we've all got old phones, we've all got old laptops. We need to incentivize people to download that material from them and then put them back into recycling. And okay, it's slightly different chemistry, but it's all going to help, and all the little bits all help contribute.
Absolutely. It's a frequent anecdote of mine, my pile of old laptops by my desk, and the need for something to be done about this this material in hibernation. So turning to China as well, Yanchen, what are the drivers there in China? And obviously it's quite successful in getting that recovery as well. So maybe you can discuss about energy security, or whether it's manufacturing security of supply. What are the drivers, and how is there that success of collection as well?
I think the first driver in China is market driver, and China has already developed a battery industry ahead of the European Union, and so they have lots of battery need to be recycled nearly end of their life, and so that is first. Its raw material is big enough in terms of scrap. The second one is because China rely on the imported raw materials for their battery production. So if you can use more raw materials from recycling industry, they can bring down the cost, so they can make more profit. That is the main market driver, I believe. The second driver is similar as the EU, the regulation driver, and so the government encourage, they said that the city mine, the definition on that, so they encourage the company to do more recycling work in the battery industry. And the last one, I think, definitely is environmental protection. That is very important. If you all scrap go to the landfill, that would be disaster for environmental. Yeah.
And perhaps on that idea of scrap going to landfill, I mean, it's noticeable that there's a big market and a growing market for lithium ferrophosphates, LFP batteries in China. How successfully are those being recycled, and is it economically sort of viable to do so?
I think in China there's still some shortage in recycling industry. The one thing is the recycler, for example, the old batteries collector still is individual person, and it's very small business, family business. They don't have enough quality equipment for recycling. So, but they just collect all of them and to make simply dismantle the old battery and sell to the next the recycler. They have enough recycling facility. So this kind of business model, need the Chinese government to monitor it very closely, but sometimes it's very difficult because too many small recycler collector in China, and that part may make some environmental damage to the industry. Yeah.
So issues with sort of informal recycling sector and not whitelist companies, if you like.
Yeah, that's why I needed the government to put more regulation in this area and to make the industry more formal and more go to the right direction. Yeah.
Absolutely, thanks. Mathilde, I just wondered if you had any sort of wider reflections on recycling drivers, or how we can, we talk about materials in hibernation and the available materials, how we might start to look at recovering these and actually capitalizing on that city mine, if you like.
So I think the availability of material is key. Sometimes it's actually the driver is just you have residues from processing, or you have residues at the mine, and you just want to make the most of it. And it costs to actually dispose it. And so there are collaboration across the critical raw materials industry to make sure that the waste can be used as a resource for another use.
Yeah, so that value capture that that Michael was talking about as well.
And I agree with what everyone said about legislation and also about making profit. I think it's a main driver too.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move direction a little bit and start talking about legislation. And I think we talked about potentially legislation as a driver, but potentially also creating barriers as well. And Chris, I'll start with you there. You alluded to it about target setting and perhaps unintended consequences of that. So maybe you could sort of explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, and first off, just a good statistic I have on the portable batteries is Europe has enough portable battery Cobalt in its lockers for 750,000 electric vehicles. So
that's incredible.
It is a resource, especially in this decade as demand ramps up, which we could be using more of. So full support there. On target setting, it's somehow counterintuitive, particularly for recycled content. If we're setting obligations for a level of recycled content in European batteries, we have to set them at a level which is working for the European industry to meet and comply with at the right level of effort. I was very struck by the presentation from your colleague in China, who really sees the batteries regulation as an opportunity because it's setting these requirements which are quite high, and China's probably well placed to bring batteries to the European market, which already meets those recycled content targets. So, as mentioned, Europe is building up its scrap pool. We don't know what's going to be there in 2030 or what might be feasible. There could be unintended consequences if we just go higher and higher and higher, that either battery manufacturers in Europe will have extra struggles to get that material, or there might be some distortions that are happening as a consequence, and other regions of the world might be advantaged. So it seems simple, we want high targets, but deceptively complex to get the right level, I guess.
Absolutely, that sort of market distortion and maybe a premium potentially on secondary materials, which I'll turn to Yanchen and talk about that, because yes, I think access to the European market for China is key, and the attention to the EU regulation is fairly an obvious step for these manufacturers. But I mean, whilst there's potential to fill that gap that Europe might not be able to supply with secondary material, is it also potentially causing sort of market distortions within China? I'm aware, I think a month ago, of a news report around secondary materials spiking way above the cost of primary materials. So perhaps you could sort of...
Yes, I think in China definitely we notice that trend, and more company, it's invested in its recycling facility in China, and even the battery producers are looking at this part of the market to do more recycling and to feed the demand gap in terms of the primary raw materials. And for example, the leading companies, GM and the CATL, they all have the recycling facility in China, and also they are not only looking at the Chinese market, they're also looking at outside China, as Chris said, and so that is, we understand that GM and the CATL have a plan to build a recycling facility in European Union, and so because the Chinese battery producers also invest battery facility in Europe. Right? They want to recycle as well, so to meet the demand, also meet the regulation in Europe. Yeah.
Mm. And you mentioned the sort of informal recycling sector, and compare that to the whitelist companies. Is that dynamic causing problems in the market and changes in price?
Yes, the informal collector, scrap collector, definitely makes the situation even worse, and the reason is first one, the environmental issue there, and the second one, in terms of market, they don't have huge investment in facility. You know, they can give the higher price to the scrap owner, you know, to collect them. But if they sell them to the formal processing plant, the price will be even higher. So they make damage of the profitability of the recycling companies. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, sort of unintended consequences, and I mean, I noted the high collection rates in China, and you suggested that was through that informal sector and sort of almost like localization, yeah. But it's having that unintended consequences on prices as well. So I think that's really interesting on legislation, that we have, that there's a driver, but also potential barriers to achieving what we want. I'm going to turn to a different bit of conversation on legislation. So, Craig, material stewardship, we talked about this, and the challenges of, you know, who is responsible for the material, who's responsible for recycling at the end of the day. Maybe you could sort of expand on that.
Sure. I guess one of the challenges is, and linked to the European battery regulations, is the definition of who is the producer and the extended producer responsibilities. So, as BritishVolt, we produce cells. We provide them to automotive manufacturers, who then collectively put them into packs and into batteries, and that battery goes onto the vehicle and goes onto the market. So in the existing legislation, and that exists for battery regulations from back in the early 2000s, which were more around lead acid, the OEMs, the automotive manufacturers, become the producer because they're producing a battery, and they've got that extended producer responsibility to take back the batteries and ensure that they're recycled appropriately. So all automotive manufacturers across Europe, if you have to look at their website, it has to have the provision of who their recycling partner is, and how people, individuals who want to get rid of the cars, can recover the batteries. And I think with the new battery regs, one of the challenges is who is the producer of the batteries. Again, it's whether it's us as BritishVolt, or other Northvolt, or other battery manufacturers, or whether it's the OEM. The UK legislation the government sort of advises, well, you're both responsible. Well, we both can't be responsible, because we can't then get the certificates that we need to prove that we've been recycled. So we've still got that challenge, and I don't know if that's being clearly resolved in the deliberations that's happening on the EU battery regulations, but it is a tricky one, because then, as I say, the OEMs who might ultimately want to go into battery manufacturing and might want to take some of that responsibility back to control the raw material recovery and produce the batteries for their vehicles, see that as an option. Equally, battery as a service, OEMs are seeing that as an option, so they can take that responsibility on. But us as the initial producers of the cells have then got the challenge, well, if it's already owned and upstream or downstream users are already taking responsibility, how do we then get that content back? And that's some of the discussions and challenges we're working with partners. Like I say, everything's partnership, so everything's moving so fast that we've all got to work together to be able to solve some of these potential challenges that we see.
Thanks. And I think, Chris, maybe you can sort of expand on that and the progress of legislation, and also I think it's tied to end of life as well, and you know, how are we retaining materials, and the legislation that might enable that or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's crucial that the legislation's there to prevent gaps, loopholes, to have that extended producer responsibility working, and as mentioned, the bigger challenge to tackle the leakage of particularly vehicles, but also electronics waste and everything else from Europe to other regions through illegal or formal channels. That's a big challenge we have. And on the topic of legislation and regulation too, I think regulation in Europe is quite high in terms of the environmental obligations, which is also a cost that recyclers have to internalize. And traditionally we've seen in other sectors of the recycling streams that's been part of the imbalance on the global level. The waste market is global. Scrap will flow to where it gets the good price. And in places like electronics waste, the internalization of those environmental costs has made that potentially easier to happen. So I think regulation plays a key role here, but it has to be quite targeted on the real issues and not just adding costs. Yeah.
Right, and within the context of sort of WTO and movement of goods, is it viable to sort of be able to control flows of materials and build that stock in Europe?
Yeah, it's a fine balance between protectionism and free and fair trade. I think what the European Union is trying to introduce is a requirement that its waste only leaves its borders with a guarantee it will be recycled under the same conditions, which is something we support as it puts recyclers on a level playing field while keeping free trade there as an integral part, but reflecting that European waste should be recycled to those standards wherever it ends up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll turn to Mathilde quickly and just thinking of that broader idea of circularity. You gave some really great examples. Have you any thoughts on maybe how legislation could be shaped to encourage circularity?
I think it's a real problematic that we see across industries in circular economy. You actually need incentives to make sure that secondary materials are less expensive than raw materials, for example. So incentives work better than punitive things for raw materials. So I think it will be more towards this kind of mechanisms.
And maybe incentivization so that my laptops actually get recycled as well. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think we've covered a bit of legislation, and we touched on there sort of batteries as a service. That makes me think of business models and governance. And maybe I'll start on business models and back to you, Mathilde. How do you see things changing or needing to change to be able to drive circularity and encourage it? I mean, you gave examples which are sort of B2B and services rather than ownership, so maybe you can sort of explore that.
I think the business models will be more and more replicated because companies want to innovate, to be exemplary, and I think also it's about making profits by reducing disposal costs, for example, and making more money through the battery as a service, for example, monthly payments, or repairing. It's different business models, but also it can. If it's not profitable yet, it can anticipate upcoming legislations with higher disposal costs. And so I see that as a main incentive, but also in terms of values, the other, on top of the value, you create a relationship, you create a value for the customer that is a different service, and that will inspire other applications across the industry.
Brilliant. And I'll turn to Michael now. Looking at your business model now and any potential future changes, what do you think it will stay the same, or do you think that there'll be changes to your business model that will help drive circularity?
Well, we intend, we're starting small, right? We can process about 4,500 tons of black mass in the first module. But I would like to go back to a point around LFPs. That was like in one of the earlier sessions, and this is a Cobalt forum, so let's talk a bit about LFPs versus NCX batteries. So there is, of course, a drive to push down the cost of cells here in order to meet prices on cars and all of this. So from the recycling perspective, I just wanted to give you this as prospective recyclers here starting out very soon, in August, in fact. We've done the models on LFP recycling, and it is really tricky to actually make money out of it. So the way we see is, if you got nickel and cobalt in the battery, you can make money out of this. And so we will take the battery and we will recycle it like many others. If you have an LFP battery, well, the lithium components in an LFP battery is actually lower than in an NCX battery. That's the first thing. And then, of course, the iron and the phosphates, these are bulk commodities that are exploited and refined at huge capacities. It's very difficult to make money out of it. And I just want to raise this point. And if you want to promote circularity, really need to solve the LFP recycling problem very soon. Although they have much longer cycle life, so you can use them for much longer. This is something that if you were going to see 30–40% of the industry relying on LFP, well, solve the recycling issue first, because otherwise Fast forward 10, 20 years, you're going to landfill all of these batteries. That's a long way of saying I have no answer to your actual question.
Thank you. No, I appreciate your reflection on LFP, and I think that's something that we're concerned about. And anecdotally, in conversations, I've heard others talk about the issues of economic viability. And so, yeah, there's a real imperative that we prevent materials going to waste. Obviously, phosphorus has got a nexus with food production as well. Now, how much influence that is from batteries, I don't know, but it's certainly something to be considered. Chris?
Yeah, I was just going to come in on the flip side, the other side of that. We're building up a huge urban mine, as mentioned, of nickel, cobalt-based battery chemistries. We also have to make sure there's a market for them, that battery, those nickel and cobalt in the decade's time when they'll become available. Otherwise, the circular economy starts to fall apart. We've made the effort to put them into the economy. We have to keep markets there, and probably that's not also thought of that highly at the moment when we're having all of these substitution discussions, but the long-term market for these resources.
And I think there's maybe then a question around incumbency, and you have these gigafactories that are ramping up and take some time to get to full production. So maybe that will answer some of those concerns around whether there's going to be a future market for those materials. That incumbency and the scale of production might mean that there's still that demand. I'm going to turn to Yanchen, and I'm thinking about business models and batteries as a service or replaceable batteries. Is that something in China that's being explored? I've heard conversations around swappable batteries and this sort of areas. Is that something you can talk to?
Yeah, I think it's the major battery replacement scheme in China is new. And they announced they can replace the battery very quickly, and for the car user, it's very easy for them to. You don't need to worry about charging time. So that is it's a new business model definitely, and they are expanding their charging battery replacement station very rapidly in China, and it's very successful so far, we can see. And I think it's easy for them, to recycling from the battery, After being tested, if they are good enough, they still can be reused, but if not good, they can recycle by themselves directly. I think in that kind of model, it's kind of a very good model for recycling business. And yeah, I think definitely if you can innovation of business model, it's good for recycling. I believe that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn to Craig on that, and maybe briefly talk about sort of batteries as a service or models. But then I'd be interested to touch on governance as well, because we haven't touched on that yet. And but we'll start with the batteries as a service idea, and any thoughts on how the market, how the industry might change.
I mean, to some degree, goes back to the previous answer I gave you on some of the legislation in terms of the ownership side of things. Our customers, OEMs, are looking how they lengthen that and how they own some of that and take responsibility for some of those batteries, because they realise there's still value in them, but until the recycling industry evolves, there's quite a cost associated with that. So the automotive manufacturers are looking at what they can do to provide them as batteries as a service. A battery at the end of life, 8 to 10 years at the end of life of a vehicle, might still have a value of a good few £1,000s. So the benefit is in the OEM trying to extend that or taking ownership. Now, it's the way they've designed, it's not that easy at the moment. The vehicle platforms, in the rush to get electric vehicles out there, the way they put the batteries on the vehicles isn't easy to remove them. As the platforms evolve, then the battery might be simpler to put on and extract, which makes that battery as a service a different option. The challenge is with OEMs that everybody buys a car. You buy a Mercedes, you buy a Volkswagen, you buy a BMW, whatever. You buy it because they have different characteristics, and so if everybody just has the same battery on the car, how do the automotive manufacturers make the car different and distinguish themselves? So I think that's the challenge if you want to be able to do some of the swap outs of batteries as a service, is that our customers of the vehicle is going to want to choose cars that the top hat looks different, but actually underneath is the same.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, we talked about, I think Michael, you talked about lead acid batteries, and that's often quoted, you know, highly recycled, highly circular now, but it's a very standardized product, and so it's that challenge of having the ability to standardize such a component. Yeah.
Yeah, and being able to capture and recycle those. So lead acid batteries, like you say, the 12-volt batteries, they're the same size. So recycling industry can put them into containers, easily move them around on vehicles to the recycling facilities. But if you look at different vehicles, an I-Pace battery on a Jaguar is 618 kilograms. You then look at the Prius or the Nissan Leaf, and it's 200 kilograms in a totally different shape. So how do recycling companies design a milk brown where they can capture all those batteries of different size and make it viable to have recycling facilities that capture them and transport them to a central entity? That's a logistics problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep you on the hot seat for a little bit longer, because on governance, and I was struck, we were at a meeting you held, and you were engaging with NGOs, third sector. It was really interesting, you getting feedback from the wider civil society about BritishVolt. But in that meeting, it really occurred to me that from the ground up, you know, circularity, sustainability is part of the governance in the company. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, and maybe that's an example that others could look at and how to incorporate in their own businesses.
Yeah, I think like I said in my intro, ESG for BritishVolt is really embedded already in the business. I've been in the business eight months, but actually lots of people have joined BritishVolt because they see it as an opportunity to help that transition. So everybody's got that awareness around environment and social issues. For me, creating the strategy and putting the structure in and the development has been quite a lot easier, because we've already got the interest in the business and we know it's important as part of what we're doing. The governance side of things, because we're starting from a new opportunity, we wanted to ensure we were reflecting and considering external stakeholders' views and putting them into our strategy. So we held the NGO event with a number of attendees to hear the concerns around human rights, around raw materials, all sorts of different topics, so that our strategy can evolve. And then when we're developing our supply chain and selecting partners, we're asking the right questions and putting the right requirements in there that externally are being driven by those external stakeholders.
Brilliant. No, thank you. And hopefully something that people will be able to take away and look at their own businesses, or how they can apply that. Because I think for us at the Cobalt Institute, we want to be able to drive circularity throughout the value chain. But I'm going to move on to my sort of last topic, I think, and it's the word that came up a lot, collaboration. And as you brought up first, Michael, I'll turn to you. You mentioned collaboration. I think, what do you think that means? And you know, are there any good examples you've had recently where opportunities have arisen because of that collaboration?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I think you know, different companies are good at different things. So we at Electra, we don't intend to do full circular recycling, you know, cam to cam, or whatever it is. So instead, we're relying on essentially partners in the nearby supply chain to see who can perform the other parts of the circularity or the supply chain that we cannot or don't want to do, or we cannot do as well as they could do. So we recently signed a contract with Glencore for the nickel and cobalt materials that we the nickel and cobalt output from the recycled materials that we process. And I think you know, case in point there is that we're essentially doing this at very, very low carbon emissions, and sending the materials to another company in the supply chain that has near zero emissions at their site. And that is important to us. And I think we will continue with those sort of relationships within the North American supply chain in coming years. So again, I say open for collaboration. This is the key thing here, and it just helps everyone move along much quicker.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'll turn to Mathilde now as well, because you're sort of tasked with helping us drive circularity and collaboration is there as one of the key points again. So maybe you can expand on your thoughts on what that might look like and how it can be effectively achieved.
So I think, so your question is about circularity.
And collaboration, how collaboration can,
So I think there are several ways to collaborate. I think collaboration with other industries could be really key. Collaboration, of course, within the same industry is much easier, but it can be done in different ways. There is still a lot to do. So, for example, if you're conceiving products, you want to make sure they're recyclable, reusable, that you can partner with other companies to really reduce energy consumption and make eco-design the most of it. If you're a client, you want to talk to your suppliers about if there are secondary materials, where do they come from, what are the specs, etc. That's what came out of this conversation several times. So I think ultimately it's really about price and about material flows, like the quantities, just to make sure that there is a match between customers and suppliers. And also you can innovate for the future by by joining research projects with circularity in their core. So LGA is involved in some of them. And last but not least, we are starting a collaboration with the Cobalt Institute, and we'll be working on circularity. So if you'd like to know more about the project, feel free to reach out after the talk.
Absolutely. I think we're very keen for engagement with our members and the wider community in the value chain, and I think there's a great deal of value that can be gained from that engagement, so we're looking forward to it. I'm mindful of time. I'll quickly go to Yanchen and maybe ask again, opportunities for collaboration in China and what that might look like in the Chinese market.
Yeah, I think collaboration, we should have a more big picture for that. And, for example, the EV battery, the Chinese government would like to encourage, after the end life of the EV battery, you may think about the reuse first, rather than scrap them. That is, you have the EV battery producer have to collaborate with other industry. For example, the renewable, they can use renewable energy as a power storage, and especially LFP battery. It's low value for recycling, but if you can, be reused in some other industry, you can make profit from that, can offset your recycling cost. That is good business model, I believe so. And the other thing is, I think, we didn't think about is the interesting point in China is because a lot of new batteries capacity in Europe, will be built soon, and a lot of pre-consumer scrap will be go to the market. So it's good for the recycling business to secure their raw materials. Yeah,
absolutely, and that talks to what Craig's been discussing with BritishVolt and pre-consumer scrap there as well. So I think we'll leave collaboration there. I'm keen to give an opportunity, although it may be brief, to open up to the audience. If there are any questions they'd like to raise with our panel, I think a microphone will be floating around at the back. So, yes, thank you. Excellent.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Robin Stoney from Glencourt, and I just wanted to say thank you very much, Tom. I think the panel has been very interesting, and thank you very much for all the people that have spoken to us today. And my question is just around supply chain due diligence as it applies to battery recycling, and what are people's thoughts on the available systems for that? So we're obviously going to need to be very process focused in terms of providing supply chain due diligence, and what are people's sort of favourite projects in that area?
Tough one. I mean, I'm looking at Craig because the most obvious person to start with, maybe. But
Yeah, I mean, you could talk for days on that, couldn't you? I think in terms of due diligence, obviously, we're at that opportunity now where we're setting our supply chain up. So we're evolving our due diligence approaches. There's various standards out there depending on how far we need to go back up the supply chain now. And like I showed on the slides earlier, I think the expectation now is we don't just go to our tier ones, our direct suppliers, but we've got to look beyond them and go right up the supply chain. And that means an understanding of all the different legislative requirements, which probably a lot of operators in the past would have only looked at the direct implications. So I think if we start looking at smelters and refining and mines and things, then there's various standards out there that in terms of specifying supply chain due diligence, we can look at. I think we're moving to a digital age where we've also, if we start mentioning the battery passport side of things, where we've got to prove and demonstrate that due diligence as well and have that go with the batteries that we're producing. So looking more at blockchain traceability as evidence to be able to prove the provenance of some of those materials as well. So I guess summarising 2 elements: which standards do you choose and then expect the suppliers to meet, and then see that continual improvement, and then how do we add in the requirements around decarbonisation and things, which, because I guess generally the focus has been on a lot on human rights, but we've got to add all those other ESG topics in now. And then secondly, having that traceability, whether it's digital, to be able to support the provenance of the battery as the producer passes it on to potentially another user or a second user or a third user that has that visibility all through the lifetime. Does that help?
So, did you have some comments as well?
I would like to maybe just add, I think it's really super good question. And we face this issue right now because we have to source black mass, right? So we have a list of 30, 35 companies that can deliver black mass to us. It's great on paper. But you have to essentially go through and see that this black mass is responsibly, the batteries are responsibly collected and shredded in an environmentally safe way. You have to do your due diligence there. But it's a much more disaggregated industry. And there are, black mass suppliers, battery shredding outfits that are popping up all over the place. And in some jurisdictions where, it's probably feasible to do it in less environmentally or ways that are less aligned with fundamental human rights, for instance. So this is something we're focusing on with Renata, our colleague here as well, and it's something we should definitely focus on as an industry in order to avoid the pitfalls that we've seen throughout the cobalt industry over the past few decades, to some extent.
Excellent, thank you. I think maybe we'll extend one last question if there is. Yes, Harry.
Hi, Harry. You had a conversation about and how those batteries ultimately get from electric vehicles back to the recyclers. Are we seeing any tangible evidence from the automakers of how they're going to make that happen? Because EV sales are picking up fairly quickly. Obviously, that material probably won't be available for 10, 15 years until those EVs come to the end of their life. But what's happening now to think ahead of that?
I think that will be
another one for me. I mean, a lot of the OEMs, because it's been such a rapid transition, I think they're still thinking about what that approach is. I'm not in the automotive sector now. I used to be, so I'm speaking, I guess, from that historical knowledge. But I think they're having to look at what they do going forward. They'd seen it as a cost burden, and if we think about lead-acid batteries, the cost for the OEMs was cost neutral, so there wasn't really a burden too much. But with lithium-ion batteries, they've got that obligation, and they don't know the ability of second use or recycling at the moment and how localised that's going to be. So it's quite a challenge that a lot of the OEMs are looking at, but equally, I think you see some of that evolution now where some of them are looking at getting into partnerships around that recycling locations to be able to then dictate the market a little bit better and influence it more. But I think it's still rapidly evolving, and yeah, I'm not in that area now, so I can't really add much more than that.
Sure.
Yeah, I have some point. It's about that. I think my understanding in China, actually, the Chinese OEM also has a responsibility for recycling the battery, and but actually the OEMs, they may not have a facility to do that, but they sign some contract with the recycling company to cooperation together for their battery recycle. Yeah.
And Chris, last point maybe.
Yeah. In Europe, we have the batteries regulation. They're also working on an end-of-life vehicles directive revision to upgrade it for essentially tackling a lot of the loopholes we have, whether it's internal combustion engines or electric vehicles. Lots of uncertainty, of course, for electric vehicles in the years ahead, but we need to make progress in getting the loopholes tackled, like the leakage of vehicles and everything else. And I think the Commission has decided voluntary measures aren't enough there, so maybe we'll see some more revolutionary ideas for how to do that in the years to come, which can facilitate those batteries in 15 years' time.
Excellent, thanks very much. I realise we are overrunning, so I will have to bring things to an end rapidly. Summary of the session, drivers, barriers, opportunities. I think we've covered those around recycling legislation, business models, governance, and obviously collaboration as well, and some really excellent inputs from our panels today. So firstly, thanks to the audience. Thank you for your attention today. Hopefully it was a useful session, a useful panel for you. And I'd just like to turn and thank our panelists again for their participation today. Thank you very much.